All right, welcome back to the Fantasy Labs podcast. This is your host, Brian Mears. We are going to break down week 3. I hope you did well in week 2, but we're going to move forward if you didn't and break down week 3. We have a couple new things going on. We actually have the entire foursome here. We got Tank. How you doing, man?
Pretty good, pretty good. Ready to get into week 3.
Yeah, I hear you.
The Dark Knight is here.
The dark.
The Dark Knight. Same bat time, same bat channel.
That's right. Yep. Peter, what's up, man?
Oh, just definitely ready for week 3, and ready to move on from week 2. So let's get it rocking.
Yeah, week 2 was a little crazy. And Bales, interestingly, every time you have broken down the slate with me and Tank on the podcast, you've won a DraftKings qualifier seat. It is 100%. It's data.
Yep. Yeah. So I'd be shocked if I don't win another in week 3.
Yeah, it has to happen. Perfect. So we have, for the first time, all 4 of us going to break down the slate. And also for the first time, we are recording this podcast as a video, and we have a new Fantasy Labs YouTube link in YouTube channel. So we are going to post all of our breakdowns every week on the YouTube channel. If you watch it as opposed to listen to it, obviously you can always listen to it on YouTube. Or iTunes rather, if you want to. But if you like watching videos and for some reason like looking at us, you can do that as well. So we'll get into it because last week we went like 2.5 hours on the breakdown. So we'll kind of get through. We're going to do it a little bit differently this week. We're going to go by position as opposed to just by game. And just kind of break down the positions. So we'll just start with quarterback, and we'll kind of just talk through our favorite plays, what we think about the top guys, and kind of just get through the whole slate that way. So let's start with quarterback. So the top 5 salaried quarterbacks this week is Aaron Rodgers. He is at home against Kansas City. Andrew Luck is right below him at 7,900. He is Brady is at home against Jacksonville. Drew Brees is going to Carolina, and Peyton Manning is going to Detroit. Those are the top 5 quarterbacks. So Tank, which one of those would be your favorite plays?
Obviously, the guy who jumps out at me first is Brady. Just for the simple fact that, I mean, it's not one of those things where you can just say, oh, New England's playing Jacksonville, because that's no longer the case. I think I said it last week that Jacksonville's defense is getting better, and they showed it against Miami last week. But Brady, I mean, those guys are good. I mean, Buffalo has a really good pass defense. They're able to rush the passer. They're able to stop the run. And Brady has one of the better games of his career. So, I mean, it's really hard to bet against him. And plus, he's going against Jacksonville. And so I would really go with Brady as my number 1 option of the higher value guys. And then number 2 would be Peter's boy, Peyton. I know a lot of people were thinking that Peyton was dead going into week 2, but then he really showed his stripes against Kansas City, coming on with a late rally and pulling the game out for the Broncos. So I would say the 2 guys that everyone expects to play well in fantasy, Brady and Peyton.
Peter, who are your favorite of the 5?
Yeah, I think I'm with Tank on Brady. I think he's clearly the number 1 option for me against the Jags. Love the matchup there. I also like Peyton Manning quite a bit because I think they're going to struggle to throw or to run the ball, so they're going to have to throw. And then the interesting guy to me is Andrew Luck. I think he's due for a big bounce back week. I know the Colts haven't looked good, but Tennessee, I'm not too worried about them. They need Tank back there playing to stop any of the passing games. So I think Andrew Luck's also a pretty good option.
Bales, what do you think?
Yeah, top guys for me are number 1, Brady. I think just because I think you can even look at him, even in cash, even at that price, against a pretty good Jags defense. If you think that the Patriots are just going to continue to throw the ball even when they're up, which it looks like they might do, if they're going to be super aggressive like they were years ago after Spygate and just continue to throw the ball, then I think that that's a pretty good play. And then I agree with Peter. Luck. is really interesting to me because anytime that you can get, I have a feeling you'll be able to get luck at decent ownership in tournaments in a really, really good matchup. And there's no reason to think that luck is like, going to have a bad game. He's coming off of two pretty poor performances, but also two pretty difficult matchups, and now he's playing the Titans. This is like sort of a dream scenario where maybe you get luck in a game where he's going to be throwing against the Titans secondary at, who knows, 7% ownership or something like that. So to me, luck is really, really interesting in tournaments because of that poor recent performance.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Brady will probably be the one of the chalky cash game plays. They are one of the higher over-unders, the Jags and Patriots, and the Pats are huge favorites. They're 13.5 favorites. So implied points puts the Patriots at 30.5 implied points, which is the highest of the slate. So obviously we would expect the Pats to put up a lot of points, and Brady's probably going to be a part of that. So if we go down, so let me, before we go down to the next group of quarterbacks, let me ask you. So Peter, you're mainly a cash game guy. Would Luck's struggles in the last two games make him a tourney-only guy for you until he shows that he's going to, perform this year, or are you fine with him in cash?
I don't mind him in cash. I think there's some better options. Certainly in that price range, I'd take the 200 savings and play Brady in cash over him this week. But I still love Andrew Luck. He's my guy, and I think he still makes a fine cash game play. I definitely prefer Brady at home, and we'll talk about some of these lower tier guys I think are also really good plays for cash.
Sounds great. So let's move on to some of the lower quarterbacks. Tank, I want to ask you specifically what you think about the Seahawks, 0-2. What's going on? We got Russell Wilson sitting here. Looks to be in a great spot. They are going against a Jay Cutler-less Chicago Bears defense, and they're playing at home. Russell Wilson seems to be in a really good spot. What's been going on with them in the first two games, and do you think you expect them to bounce back and get a big win here?
I think one of the major issues with the Seahawks is that they haven't been able to run the ball. I mean, they're one of those teams where their entire offense is predicated on running the ball and setting everything up off of that, and they just haven't been able to get it done. And then at the same time, the defense has struggled as well. So when I look at Seattle going into this game with Chicago, I mean, it actually ends up being a perfect storm in their favor with Jay Cutler being out. So you have that defense that's been struggling a little bit facing Jimmy Clausen, and then you flip it to Russell, the guy we're talking about right now, going against a defense that has struggled to play, against the run and the pass. So I look for, one, them to establish Marshawn Lynch. Two, with the establishment of Marshawn Lynch, a lot of play action with the balls going to Jimmy Graham and then also to Doug Baldwin, too. You're going to see Russell move a lot with the ball in his hands. He's going to make some plays with his legs. I look for this game to be the one where, a lot of guys that have been struggling on offense finally get off, and then they try to get into a routine moving forward.
Yeah, the one interesting thing for me is Jimmy Graham is complaining. There's reports that he's very upset about how he's being used. Only 10 targets through the first 2 weeks, so I definitely anticipate some more balls going his way, and I think Marshawn Lynch, we'll talk about him with running backs, he's in a lead spot too.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was listening actually to the Grantland NFL podcast earlier today, which is awesome, and they were talking about how Seattle kind of struggles to integrate unique players into their offense. I mean, thinking Jimmy Graham this year, but then also Percy Harvin. You have unique talents that do some different things, and for some reason they just don't fit in Seattle for some reason. So we can talk about Jimmy Graham once we get to tight ends. Bales, among these kind of mid-range quarterbacks here, which one stands out? Is it Russell to you as well?
Yeah, so Russell's actually my top projected quarterback, not just value. He's my number one quarterback this week against the Bears because so we're talking about Jimmy Graham. I think part of it is that what Breeze did well is sort of throw Jimmy open. Jimmy won't necessarily get open in the typical way that a receiver is going to get open, but he's still open because he is like crazy ball skills, and it just sort of it doesn't matter if he's covered, and Breeze knew where to throw the ball. And Russell Wilson is a pretty accurate quarterback, but I don't think that's what he does. He sort of scrambles around, and Jimmy Graham isn't necessarily going to get open in that way. So that's really big reason for concern for Graham. But that sort of might help Wilson's value a little bit if they're going to run with him in the red zone and things like that. And I think that the Bears could potentially be blitzing him a bunch, where I would expect them to be used as a runner or scrambling a lot in this game. The only thing that I don't really like is that they're such big favorites that if he doesn't score early, like Lynch scores the touchdowns early, and they get up, that they could just sort of run the clock out. So I think he's a little bit riskier of a play than he normally would be, because there's a good chance that in the second half they're just not really throwing the ball or dropping back much, or he's not running the ball and they're giving it to Lynch a lot. But I still think, just in terms of where I'm projecting him on the ground versus that $7K salary, that's one of the my top value on DraftKings for sure.
Yeah, so last week we had a kind of a similar situation, even though it wasn't as big, where we had the Saints playing who we thought was a bad Bucks team at home, and they were double-digit favorites. And we got that even more here with the Seahawks, and they are 14.5-point favorites at home against the Bears. And last week we saw with that big favorite that Breeze struggled. I'm not sure it's because he was the favorite or anything like that, but I do kind of share Bales' worry that it might just go all to the run game. Peter, what are your thoughts on that? Does that make him a risky cash play for you, or is it still you just think he could hit it in a half and it doesn't matter?
Yeah, there's definitely some risk, obviously, with the running game. We'll talk defenses a little later, too, but I think Seattle's in a great spot there. So there's some game flow scenarios where Wilson might not put up big numbers. Defense gets a couple touchdowns or something like that, or Lynch gets all the rushing touchdowns. But I still think he's in for a good game, and he definitely has huge upside as well. I mean, Wilson could rush to it. I mean, anything could happen here. I feel very confident in Seattle winning this game. So they're going to get points. It's just a matter of how. And from a fantasy perspective, there's definitely options with Wilson, the pass catchers, Marshawn Lynch, and even the defense.
And I think there's one thing that I have to know too, just coming from the playing side of it. Like, this is an emotional game, and then guys take a lot of pride in what they do. And so in one respect, I mean, I went into last week thinking that the Saints should just blow Tampa Bay out based off what the Titans did to them the week before. But, I mean, if you see, look at Tampa Bay last year when they played Atlanta. They got blown out. Then they come back the next game and they put up a good performance, and I believe they won that next game. It's just because one of those things, like when you get blown out, you get embarrassed. That next week of preparation, everyone's like a little bit more locked in. Everyone's a little bit more focused, and then you usually see teams come out with a better performance, especially early in the season after a blowout like that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I wanted to ask Tank, too, specifically. This is right up your alley as well. Chancellor coming back, I mean, that has to mean a ton for Seattle, right?
It's going to be a huge emotional lift for him. I mean, you've heard everyone in the locker room saying that he's one of the silent leaders. And I think more than anything else, he's a tone setter. And that's one of the things I like to do when I was playing safety. If you have somebody that comes in when there's a little bit of uncertainty about how your team's performing, you come in, you lay a big lick or make an emotional play early in the game, everyone rallies around that, and then it just gets everyone vibing on defense, and then that carries over to offense, special teams. So I would expect him to provide a huge emotional lift not only to the team but to the fans, and then they're going to end up running away with this game against the Bears. They just run into a damn train this week.
Tank, one question. So there's this assumption, and one of the reasons that I like Wilson, that quarterbacks who run it's easier to run when a team is going to blitz or play man coverage than it is against zone. Is that true in your experience, where if you guys run a lot of man, that it's harder to defend a running quarterback?
Absolutely. And the reason for that is because whenever you're playing man-to-man defense, your back is to the quarterback.
Right.
They have two safeties over the top. All the corners and linebackers are running with the receivers. So if the quarterback can find a gap between the defensive line, he has nothing but space and opportunity to run for a first down or a touchdown. And that's what Michael Vick used to do all the time. So a lot of times if teams play zone defenses, you won't see the quarterbacks have that much success, but definitely against man defenses and teams that love the blitz, a quarterback will go crazy if he's mobile. So that's a great point, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, great points all around. So let's move on and talk about some of the lower quarterbacks in the tier. I do want to ask you guys what you think about Sam Bradford. He's in a tough spot this week. He's going against the Jets, and they've shown to be a good defense and obviously contain Andrew Luck and force him into a lot of turnovers on Monday night. But just in general, Tank, what are your thoughts on what was supposed to be such a potent offense in Philly? What's going on?
They can't run the ball. It's just that simple. I had opportunity to see the Chip Kelly offense a lot during his days in Oregon since I'm a Stanford alum. And the key to that offense is running the ball. I believe I said that before as well. And last week, I think DeMarco Murray finished with like -5 yards. If they can't run the ball, they get in predictable passing situations. And then Sam Bradford's not a running threat as a quarterback. And so teams are able to take advantage of that. Until they can figure out that run game and figure out the problems that they have along the offensive line, they're going to struggle. And as you can see, I mean, a lot of the defenses were able to penetrate and make plays behind the line of scrimmage, and they're playing the Jets. And the Jets' defensive front has looked awesome to start this season. And so, I mean, for them to try to get back on track this week, I mean, they have one of the toughest matchups that they'll face all year. The secondary players, I mean, Darrell Reeves is in Pro Bowl form already. I mean, he's on top of the receivers and not giving any of the receivers much room to work over the middle or deep down the field. And so it's going to be tough sledding for Sam and the Eagles.
Yeah, that was what was so interesting to me about that, that they brought him in, that it did seem like the ability for the quarterback in that offense to at least have threat of running is pretty crucial, because now when they run it's not read option because Bradford's not really a threat to run, but when they run that sort of look, you can just the defense can just bear down on DeMarco or Matthews or Sproles, and just let Bradford go. He's not really he hasn't pulled the ball. I haven't seen him pull the ball at all this year, and run with it. And it seemed like that was a pretty crucial aspect of their offense that's missing, and probably a reason they can't run. And then if you can't run, it's obviously much harder to do everything else off of that.
Yeah, and it's weird to me that they're running DeMarco Murray so east and west. I know they like to do a lot of those runs where they pull the guard from the other side and sweep him out, but it just doesn't look right. DeMarco Murray doesn't have that same, lateral quickness and movement that like a LaShawn McCoy or even Darren Sproles has. He's more of a north and south runner, and I think Tate nailed it. I mean, the offensive line's been playing pretty bad, and I think if that doesn't change and if they can't figure out how to run the ball, it's going to be hard for Sam Bradford to be successful.
Yeah, I hear you. So speaking of quarterbacks who have a running threat, someone answer for me why Tyrod Taylor is still below 6,000.
He's the play this week. I think at quarterback in cash games, it's him or Brady for me as of now. He's just way too cheap, and even in a game where Buffalo didn't look great and it looked kind of miserable at first for him, I mean, you saw the upside that he has and how he can just rack up fantasy points in a hurry with his legs and throwing the ball. So he's way too cheap. I think he's 5,800. That's a steal.
Yeah, Bales, what do you think of that? And also, Andy Dalton has put up right about 20 fantasy point performances in the first 2 weeks, and just still crazy cheap, 5,700. Going against, the Ravens, I guess they're okay, but I mean, Oakland hanged, I don't know, like 30 points on them last week. So if Derek Carr can go off, I'm assuming that maybe AJ Green can too.
Yeah, as far as Tyrod, I think he's underpriced, and I also think he's one of those quarterbacks that is the matchup doesn't matter as much. So he's playing the Dolphins. They have pretty good pass defense. He played the Patriots last week. It doesn't matter as much as for someone like say Carson Palmer, who sticks in the pocket, and the opponent plus minus, for example, that we have on Fantasy Labs probably is more relevant for a player like him than for Taylor, because Taylor can take off on the ground, and so if things aren't covered and they're playing man or whatever, he has a ton of fantasy value, and arguably in some situations better fantasy value if a team is going to play man and covers well, because he's going to take off as a runner. I have a Dalton as a mid-tier value. The really cheap quarterback who's sort of interesting to me, but really, really risky. Where I'm not going to play him in cash, I think, but I still think he's just very interesting to me. Is Nick Foles against the Steelers at home? The Steelers are really, really bad against the pass. I think Nick Foles is 5,200. Something like that, and it could be a situation where the Rams get down and he's forced to throw the ball a bunch. I hate his receivers there, and so it'd be a situation where I probably don't even stack him with someone. I mean, you could go Britt, you could go Jared Cook, I guess. Both of those guys can score, but it could be Tavon Austin there, who I'm not gonna play. So it might be a situation where in a tournament I don't even stack him, but I do think he's underpriced and is going to throw the ball a bunch in a game that could weirdly become a shootout, I think.
Yeah, Nick Foles can definitely throw it around. Actually, on our NFL news site, wrote a blurb about Foles earlier today because, he was going against the Steelers this week, and using our opponent plus-minus metric, the Steelers were pretty by far the worst against quarterbacks as far as what they give up in terms of expected versus or actual versus expect. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I think I don't have it up. I think it's 4.4 points above expectation the past 16 games for them, which is really, really high. It's really bad.
Yeah, and just for reference, if for other positions in that kind of metric, even just being 1 point above expectation is good, and they're 4.5. So just imagine that. So they're really bad, is what we're saying. So Nick Foles, I do like. Tank, I wanted to ask you specifically about this week because this is kind of the first week where injuries are going to play a big factor into the slate. We have Romo out. We have possibly multiple McCowns starting in the NFL. What are your thoughts on? What are your thoughts on these quarterbacks, and should we just avoid their offenses altogether?
I think there are likely better plays out there than playing some of these backups. I like Whedon's matchup against Atlanta, but I mean, if you're looking at him at 5,200, then I'll much rather play Ryan Fitzpatrick against the Eagles, or like you said, Nick Foles against Pittsburgh, than going with Brandon Wheaton. And then the McCowns, I really wouldn't touch them at all, even though Josh is at 5,000 against Oakland. So, yeah, I think I would go another route with a more proven commodity versus going with those guys.
Yeah. What are your
I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I feel the same way. I think Tank nailed it there, and it's just one of those things. I mean, there's always merit to taking some of these guys in tournaments, but I just think there's a lot of good options, and I think that there's some even better contrarian plays this week.
Yeah. So I guess in a tournament, especially like a Millie Maker tournament, you're obviously looking for contrarian upsides, but probably the player pool of quarterback, wide receiver stacks that could even potentially get you to where you need to be is probably limited. Just because Brandon Whedon is going to be lower owned doesn't mean he's a good play. And I guess a Jimmy Clausen, Martellus Bennett stack would probably win you the mill if you were willing to take that risk and then it went off. But I don't know, Bales. What do you think about? Is there just a limited amount of stacks that are viable each week?
Yeah, I think so. It's not that it can't happen. Fitzpatrick threw 6 touchdowns last year. I think he was in a good matchup. I believe it was the Titans, right? Yeah, I think that people try to be too contrarian. You don't need to be contrarian at every single spot, and that you just limit your chances of the lineup going off. It's not like baseball where there's so much lineup overlap with stacking that you can just be very, very contrarian and it makes sense. I don't think you need to be contrarian at most spots in NFL. You can play just good values, guys with high upside, maybe emphasize ownership a little bit, and then look for those guys who are going to be super low owned. So last week for me it was Deion Lewis. who I liked quite a bit, who was very low owned, and Larry Fitzgerald, who is in 7%. So guys like that, if you have a couple contrarian elements to your lineup, then it's not like you need to have under 5% at every single spot, because the guys who are high owned are in a lot of lineups for a reason. They're typically the best values. Sometimes there's mistakes, I think, but for the most part, it's fairly efficient where the guys who are the most lineups are offer the most value. So it's just a balance, and when you get too far into contrarian plays and have guys who are in 2% of lineups across your entire roster, it's just as bad as or worse than playing a completely chalk lineup in one of those tournaments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good points. Sounds great. So any other thoughts about quarterbacks before we move on to running backs?
I just want to make one more comment, too, about just being contrarian in the NFL. And while it's not like the NBA where everything's really predictable and there's limited variance, it's still an event-based sport. It's not as far as baseball or, say, NHL. And there's a phrase that's been said a lot, just throughout daily fantasy by a number of people, and it's like, you can be contrarian, just don't be stupid. And, there's certain picks that, Clausen, going into Seattle, maybe I'll look stupid saying this, but, there's just no way he'll see any of my rosters. So I think there's definitely a fine line between being contrarian and, then just being straight stupid. Some of these guys, no one's going to own him, he's going to be 0.1% owned or whatever. And it's like, well, there's a reason. He's not going to get the opportunity, or he just has, the worst possible matchup. So I think there's a fine line there. And, Nick Foles is the perfect one for me, where I definitely would take a chance on him. He's, a great contrarian play, whereas, Clausen probably I won't be touching.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You can be contrarian and still be on good players. So Fitzgerald last week, he's still a really, really good receiver, right? And people were just down on him for whatever reason. And then there's other situations where maybe a player is just a bit overpriced, where it's going to affect his ownership, but it doesn't change his matchup. He's not going to play any better or worse because DraftKings priced him differently. So when you have a really elite player who's just, he's a bit overpriced, where you might have to pay $500 more than you should, but he's in a really, really good spot where you can get say a Calvin Johnson at 5 or 6 or 7% ownership, then that's a really smart play on a really good player versus Clausen is a good example. I won't be playing him at all. Yeah, you're going to get him at probably under 1% ownership, but it doesn't really matter. The chances of him doing well are so limited.
Yeah, and the last point here, Bales made a great point. That's my favorite way to be contrarian by far on DraftKings, is to basically pay up to be contrarian, and that's something that's worked a bunch, and certainly a strategy that I've used throughout, playing NFL for 4 years now. Playing daily fantasy NFL, not like Tank in the NFL. Playing daily fantasy.
So do you guys measure what you expect the ownership of a player in a tournament to be versus the probability of them going off, and that's kind of how you make decisions? I don't know, Jimmy Clausen is probably going to be less than 1% owned in a Millie Maker, but he also probably has less than 1% of possibility of being the top quarterback that week. So is that how you kind of measure them? Is thinking about those two things in unison?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead, Bales.
Yeah, for me, I sort of set the exposure that I want to have to players. So if I theoretically would have 100 lineups, I don't have that many typically, but if I were to have 100 lineups, how many lineups would I naturally want these players in based on their value? And then how many do I think they're going to be in? And then I compare those numbers. And when a player is going to be in a lot more lineups than what I want him in, I'm actually going to have him in a lot fewer than what I naturally want him in, because I think that's where that's where value isn't. And when I want to have a player in a bunch of lineups, so last week I wanted to have Fitzgerald in a pretty healthy number of my lineups naturally, and then I sort of projected that he wasn't going to be in a ton, and so I bumped that up even more, where I had him in almost all of my lineups, I believe, on DraftKings, just because that there's a whole bunch of value that he's already offering in that situation, I thought, and then there's even more usable tournament value, because if you hit on him, the payoff is really great. And so, yeah, I'm always comparing those things and trying to get the most exposure to guys that I'm more high higher on them than what the public might be.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. So let's move on to running backs, and we'll start with kind of the top five, and then we'll move on to the mid and then the lower plays. So the top five running backs this week, we have at the top Adrian Peterson. He's probably going to be at the top just about every week. He is at home against San Diego. He's 7,500, and then we get the intro of Le'Veon Bell. His first game of the year after his suspension. He's going on the road against the Rams, so tough matchup in his first game against that front four. He's at 7,500 as well. Jamal Charles is number 3. He's on the road at Green Bay. He's 7,400. And then we have Marshawn Lynch in what looks like a dream matchup. He's at 7,400. Matt Forte is the next. He's the 5th running back. He's at 7,300 in that same matchup against Seattle. I assume that a Lynch Seattle defense stack will be probably the highest owned stack probably in the entire NFL season, which is how obvious it is. But we'll kind of start with Tank. What are your thoughts on those 5 quarterbacks? Do you have one that stands out to you?
I mean, I don't think I really need to touch on the Lynch deal just because, I mean, like you said, I mean, that's just a known commodity. I feel like Lynch is going to get off against Chicago, and I think the defense is going to play well. That's a perfect pairing with those two. When you look at Le'Veon Bell against St. Louis, I mean, you think of them as a tough run defense, but then at the same time, the Washington Redskins ran all over them last week. But then just going back to what I was talking about with the Saints and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I mean, the Rams pride themselves on being able to stop the run. That's one of the things that Jeff Fisher stresses. And so then you have Matt Jones and Alfred Morris run all over them last week. They're going to make sure that Le'Veon Bell doesn't get off. If anyone gets off, it's going to be Antonio Brown, not Le'Veon Bell. So if I'm going to bet highly on someone, it'll be AB. So I would say that probably my top players at running back this week will likely be Adrian Peterson, number 1. Well, of course, Marshawn Lynch, number 1, but besides him, I would say probably Peterson and then Charles. I like both of those matchups against San Diego's run defense and then against Green Bay.
Tank, I have a question for you. So pertaining to St. Louis, and this is something that a lot of people are talking about going into the week and how it's a classic letdown spot. St. Louis has a huge win at home against Seattle, division rival, and then has to travel, all the way to Washington, and it's a classic emotional letdown spot. As a player, I mean, is that something that you think is real? I mean, it seems to definitely play true in these games, just following the NFL for a while now. But is that something you think that there's merit to?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think they took that game for granted. I mean, because I believe everyone else, especially me, I mean, I betted on Nick Foles like there was nothing else because I didn't think Washington's defense would be able to stand up to St. Louis, even though they don't have the threat of, most passing teams here in the NFL. And so it was just one of those deals where they went into the game and they let down on offense, they let down on special teams and defense. But I can guarantee going back to St. Louis this week, playing at home after getting embarrassed in Washington, you're going to see the same team that got up for Seattle with a tough Pittsburgh team going into the Dome. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and it's good to hear your perspective on that. I guess I'll just jump in here with the running back take. I agree with Tank. I love Adrian Peterson this week. I think he's really elite play. I mean, obviously in cash games, you kind of build around Marshawn Lynch. I think that's a no-brainer. His touchdowns at home versus on the road are just amazing. I mean, he just consistently scores at home, and he gets to see the Skittles on the field, which is great. So, huge fan of Marshawn Lynch myself as well. Love Jamal Charles, and I think those are the 3 top guys there at the top. I think Le'Veon Bell is interesting. I know that they're going to try to stop the run, St. Louis, and they definitely have an elite front 4. The thing about Le'Veon Bell, though, is he has elite catching ability relative to other running backs, and I think that's really valuable in DraftKings. My one concern, and I'm curious, Bales, if you've seen anything, or Bryan, my concern is that he's going to kind of get eased back in, and with D'Angelo Williams playing well, we might not see the normal 25, 30 touches that he got all the end of last year.
Yeah, I think that's a situation to monitor. Collect information throughout the week on that, because if he's limited, then he's probably going to be overpriced. If he's not, And I don't think he's overpriced even in a tough matchup because of that pass catching ability, like you said. Just makes him so safe to the point that, I mean, I don't know. I don't think that I'm going to have him in cash just because Lynch, I think, is so obvious that he might be in every lineup. And if you're not going big at both running back spots, then you might not be playing him. But I wouldn't. I don't think that it's. I wouldn't laugh at someone who put him in cash because if you think he's going to play every snap like he did last year, the matchup doesn't matter as much for him. He's sort of similar to Tyrod Taylor or Russell Wilson or Cam Newton at quarterback in that way, that because of that sort of diversified skill set and that he gets fantasy points from all these different avenues, that he's not as matchup dependent. And so I think he could have a pretty big game there if he's getting the snaps. And then for tournaments, I think a guy that people are going to get away from a lot is Forte. And I'm sort of undecided on him. I think that he's going to get a lot of targets because the Seahawks obviously defend the outside so well and are much worse against tight ends and running backs out of the backfield. I think he's going to get. I think this is a situation where he gets maybe 10 or more targets in this game, especially with Clausen at quarterback. But the Bears are projected so low that he's just such a bad bet to score, and so I think his upside is limited in that way. So I'm a little bit undecided on him. I definitely think he's contrarian, but as of now, I probably won't have too much of him. I think that Le'Veon Bell is potentially a better tournament play if you think his ownership is going to be down a bit, and some of the other top price backs right now. But yeah, he's definitely someone that I still need to think about that is interesting for me right now.
So I disagree with you guys a little bit on Le'Veon Bell, and I'll state my point, and then you guys can tell me how stupid I am. So I agree that he's fine in cash games because he's matchup dependent and just such a talent. But I'm worried about his ownership in tournaments. Because I think that we see him and we think that his ownership's going to be depressed because we see that matchup against the Rams and that people will be off him, and then we think, oh, well, I can get on him because he's matchup dependent, so I get that edge. But I think with the struggles of the top running backs, even particularly last week, with you have Marshawn struggling and you have Lacey going out early and even like Ingram, who was supposed to be the kind of the chalky cash play, struggling, and it's just feels like it's kind of hard to nail running backs. I mean, D'Angelo Williams and David Johnson were the top running backs of last week. So I feel like people are going to say, oh, Le'Veon Bell, that guy who was so good last year, yeah, finally he's back. Let me just plug him in because I know he's going to get me some fantasy points. So I'm afraid in tournaments that his ownership is going to be a lot higher than maybe we think because of the matchup.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that there's merit to that, and I mean, we can't forget what he did last year. I mean, the guy was just unbelievable.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that as well. Just he's a difficult guy to project, and I also don't know. It depends probably what league you're in too, what the buy-in is. So that's always super important. If you're in a $3 or even the Millionaire Maker, where you have a bunch of people who this is the first time playing. They're really not price sensitive. They don't care as much about the matchup. They just care more about the name and just fitting guys in that they know. And maybe ownership is a bit higher in that than it would be in, say, a game changer $1,000 buy-in or something like that.
Yeah.
That is a good point. Yeah. So yeah, let's move on to a couple of lower running backs. Right below them is actually Jeremy Hill, which I think is someone probably that we need to talk about, just because he was projected to be one of the top running backs of the year, one that could be a cash game play just about every week, just because of Cincinnati, how run heavy they're going to be, and how he's going to get the bulk of the carries. But then he had those early fumbles, and then Gio goes crazy. Tank, what are your thoughts on that situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's really tough just for the reason that you said. I mean, he has those couple early fumbles, and then Gio goes off. And it's one of those things where, especially when you have a young back, they always want to stress the emphasis of, like, ball security. And the best way to do that is to sit a guy on the bench. Now, I thought I read something stating that Jeremy Hill's not going to stay in the doghouse, and so you'd expect him to get a fair amount of carries moving forward. But at the same time, with Gio having such a great game, Jeremy Hill putting the ball on the ground a couple of times, that it may turn into more of a timeshare than it originally was to start the season and end of last year. So definitely have to take that into consideration and price that to whether you want to take him or maybe someone else that may see a few more touches that has a similar price tag, or actually less, like a Justin Forsett or something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that this tier is really interesting, kind of in the mid-range. Jeremy Hill, my goodness, what an awful week. I had some exposure to him across the industry, and that did not work out well at all, obviously. To me, the interesting thing is going to be if Eddie Lacy plays or not, because that kind of dictates how you're going to use running backs. Like, a lot of these guys are definitely in play. I mean, we have to monitor the Murray injury. I probably won't be playing him, but it'll open up, potentially Ryan Matthews. If Lacy doesn't play, Starks will be a great play. So running back for me is really going to depend on that stuff. And if everyone plays, I think the guy kind of towards the lower end of the mid tier. I like Forsett, but then I also like Latavius Murray going against Cleveland. That's a guy I think is in a pretty good spot. Bales, what are your thoughts on these kind of mid-tier running backs?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because the mid-tier guys, I think, are the most crucial guys to get correct. So we always know, that, Marshawn and Le'Veon and AP, we know what those guys are, and it's more or less, it's easier to assess them, and it's especially easy to find the value when a guy goes down with the cheap backs, so Starks and maybe a Ryan Matthews or whatever if Murray's out with the hamstring today. It's much easier than in the middle, where you have guys whose workload is maybe a little bit less certain, so we know what sort of workload Marshawn is going to get, especially if the Seahawks are up. We know Peterson's going to get his, and that's sort of why you're paying up for those guys. Whereas, say a Jeremy Hill, we don't know necessarily. We don't know because of the uncertainty with the fumbles and Gio there. We don't know if they're down, then probably Gio's going to come on the field, so he's a little bit dependent on game script. Same thing with Latavius a bit. So hitting on those guys, saving money when you can find one of those guys who you're confident is going to have a pretty good workload, I think is pretty crucial. And you mentioned one guy that I do like a lot, which is on DraftKings, because of the full PPR, is Justin Forsett, because I'm not as concerned about whether they're up or down. I think he can provide value, arguably more value even when they're down if he's getting a bunch of targets. He can score, and I don't necessarily think he's an elite talent. It's more just about the workload there in Baltimore. So when you can save a little bit of money on one of those guys and still get close to that guarantee of touches, then I think that's ideal, because you can pay up, especially in tournaments. You can pay up for an Antonio Brown or a Julio or something like that, who just have so much more upside than some of the cheaper receivers. But I do agree the running back strategy is completely dependent on if a guy on the injuries, because there could be an automatic start basically if one of those guys is out, which completely changes everything.
Yeah, and I want to ask you guys specifically how you would handle a situation like that in a tournament. But first, I do want to ask Tank about Forsett. This is a guy that in our first podcast that we were both high on in this specific offense, and even in last week's week 2 breakdown, I think all three of us were pretty high on Forsett's matchup last week, and he's had two kind of games. He had about 10 points and then 12 points. Even though they scored a lot of points against Oakland. Tank, what are you seeing with Forsett? Is it just not getting into the end zone? I mean, it looks like his yards per carry is pretty good. He's at 4.5.
Yeah, actually, that's one thing that I probably have to come back to it. Like I said before we got on the podcast, I've probably made it through about 70% of the games, but the Oakland Raven game, I haven't had an opportunity to look through all the way yet. And so before commenting on that, I mean, I think I'd rather just address that on Twitter with a follow-up versus trying to speak on that right now.
Fair enough, yeah. So we can we'll follow up with Tank on Twitter and hear his thoughts on that later. So let's talk about that specific problem. All right, so if Eddie Lacy is out, then that means Starks is going to get the start, and he's at complete min price. He's at 3,000 on DraftKings. So him paired with Lynch, you can easily pair them just because you're getting the salary relief of Starks. But everyone is going to be on him. So the question is what do you do in tournaments? I looked at all the million makers, and I posted an article on Fantasy Labs about what the winning lineups consisted of. And every winning lineup last year, and I think it's kind of kept the same trend this year, had obviously contrarian plays in some places, but they also had just about every lineup had a player that was at least 20% owned. So it's kind of showing that you can go value and contrarian. You have to go contrarian, but you could also go value. It's not like you have to go contrarian everywhere. So Peter and Bales, Eddie Lacy is not starting. Just assume that. Hypothetical situation. What do you do in tournaments? I mean, do you try to go contrarian in receivers and just get that safety at running back, or do you fade that, hoping that maybe Starks is a bad game, or what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, if Lacy's out for cash, it's a no-brainer. You play Starks, can catch the football. Just it is what it is. Tournaments, of course, there's merit to fading him. It's the same kind of situation as we had Devontae Adams week 1, where I thought he was, must play in cash. Still feel the same way given the same data, but in tournaments, there's always merit to fading these guys because for them to be a winning tournament play, they have to get in the end zone. They need that event. They need that big play. So it's possible. Starks gets 10 carries, 11 carries, and rushes for like 50 yards, gets 3 or 4 catches, and he doesn't put up that big number that enables you to win a tournament. So I think there's always merit, but if Eddie Lacy's out, I'm gonna have a lot of Starks. So it is what it is.
Yep, I agree with that. I think it's harder to be contrarian at running back when there's an obvious value than it is at receiver, because the workload, if you think Starks is going to get a heavier workload, he's less likely to put up a dud than Devontae Adams was in week 1, even though he was an obvious value. Everyone put him in all their cash games. I thought that was a pretty obvious play, but he still wasn't guaranteed anything just because, we might have been expecting, 7 targets in that situation. He's naturally going to catch maybe 60% of his targets. So just due to bad luck, he might only catch a few, which I believe ended up happening. And so it's harder. It's much more difficult to be contrarian at running back where those workloads are guaranteed. So cash games, I'll play Starks for sure if Lacy is out. And then in tournaments, I think it's more a matter of sort of like your own risk tolerance. So if you think it's going to be profitable to fade Starks, that's what you think is the most profitable thing. You could fade him in every single lineup. So say you play 10 lineups, you don't play him at all. If he goes off, you're going to probably have a really bad week. And so you're just taking on a lot of variance there. And so I think you just have a decision to make if you want to be in line with where the public is on him to sort of neutralize the effect on him. You're basically saying, I think it might be a good idea to fade him, but I don't really want to take on that sort of risk, so I'm just going to play him in 3 of my 10 lineups, and maybe that's in line with where, or 4 of 10, and that's where in line with his ownership. And if he goes off, it doesn't really help me, it doesn't really hurt me. I think that you could potentially do that and just try to win at the other spots. You could completely fade him, or you could just go, you think he's going to have a huge week, you're even higher on him than where you think his ownership is going to be, you could just put him in a whole bunch of lineups and try to benefit that way. But I do think that in tournaments, when it comes to exposure, it's more a matter of your own personal. It of course matters where you think his ownership is going to be and where you have him projected. Those are the most important things. But the risk tolerance and how much risk you want to take on also affects that, because if you want to truly be a contrarian player, you're going to lose more than you win, and you have to take on a lot of risk. And the hope is that when you do hit, you hit in a really, really big way that makes up for it. But it's difficult because you'll lose a bunch that way.
Yeah, that is a good point. So a question for I guess all of you, and it's kind of hypothetical, maybe difficult to answer, but is there a point at which a player has an ownership where he's just like an auto fade? Like what highs, is there a spot where it's just too high?
For me, yeah. I mean, even even in a, like if I were in a 50-50, and even in a 50-50, if I knew someone were in every other single lineup, and I had two guys that were close, of course I would take the player who I thought was going to be lower owned, even if you were slightly worse value. Cash games are mostly about value, but I don't think ownership is. You should completely ignore it in extreme cases. But yeah, for sure. Probably when you're getting to like 50% in a tournament, regardless of the value, you probably are looking at a fade, I think. And it depends on the position, too. Receivers and tight ends probably a bit lower. But I think it depends. It just depends on the situation. If you have a very, very obvious backup running back who's min-priced, who's going to get all the carries, then it is tough to fade a player in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, for cash games, I pretty much disregard it altogether. I just pick what I think is the optimal lineup. If there's someone like in Bale's situation, it just doesn't come up often, right? Like if someone's going to be owned in 95% in cash games, like clearly there's a reason, and I'm going to be on that same guy for cash games. In tournaments, it matters so much to really figure out, being contrarian, where you stand on certain players versus what you think the field is going to do. So. Especially in football still, it's not like baseball or NHL like we talked about before, but it's still an event-based sport where touchdowns mean so much that you can definitely take shots and be contrarian. And I think, especially when you're talking about fading, a guy entirely, I think it makes a lot of sense, especially in a tournament like the Millionaire Maker where there's so much of the prize in like the first couple spots. So I don't mind it. If Lacy was ruled out, I wouldn't mind to start Spade, especially in all your lineups if you're going after something like the Millionaire Maker. If you're playing just general tournaments, I probably wouldn't do it just because there's still a lot of value in just traditional cashes.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think that's a great point. It's not every GPP is the same. So if you're playing in a 100-man, it could be completely different than the Millionaire Maker, and the payout matters too. So if you're in a 100-man queue, you do want to embrace variance and probably want to be more contrarian because the payout is so top-heavy versus a 100-man traditional GPP. You can play way more of a lineup that resembles a cash game. So the payout structure of the league that you're in addition to the size, matters so much for how contrarian I think you should be.
Yeah, that is a good point. I actually got a question from a user that I was talking to you, Bales, about, and the user was saying that he was in a 8-man league or something like that, and it was like maybe the top 1 or 2 places get paid out, and he was wondering if he should go kind of a cash strategy or a GPP strategy. And I think a lot of people have that question of like how, like in a GPP, like how many users does it have to be for me to go like super contrarian as opposed to like a mix? And I think that's probably maybe something that we could do as a breakdown or a different video. We probably don't have time tonight, but it's definitely interesting, and the point stands that you should be aware of the payouts as a basis of how contrarian you should be. So cool. So any other maybe under the radar running backs for you guys, or any plays that we haven't got to? I know Starks obviously we've talked a lot about, but anything else before we move to wide receivers? Anyone?
I'm good.
All right, fair enough. All right, so let's move to wide receivers, and we'll go top 5 again. So number 1, as always, Julio. He is going against Dallas. He's at 9,000. Odell is right up with him. He is 9,000 as well at home against Washington. Antonio is at 3. He's 8,900. He is going against the Steelers on the road. Next is Demarius, who I think is interesting. He's at Detroit this week. He is so we have a huge jump here, actually. So Julio, Odell, and Brown are 9,000, 8,900 respectively, and then the next guy is 8,000. So we got a $1,000 jump, or jump down rather, to Demarius, and then Calvin Johnson is at 7,900 in that same matchup. So Tank, give me your thoughts on those 5 guys.
I mean, it's interesting because, we always look at Antonio Brown being a volume guy, but I was actually watching the Falcons game against the Giants earlier today, and I believe Julio had 7 catches in the first quarter. And that's just ridiculous. And then that's like on the level with Antonio Brown. So when you're looking at guys being heavily targeted, regardless of the matchup, Julio's right there with AB. So, I mean, I really like him, even though, he's going up against a tough matchup against the Cowboys. I like Antonio whenever he steps on the field. And like we talked about earlier, I think that the Rams are going to put an emphasis on stopping the run after that performance they put up against the Rams. And even when people focus on stopping an AB, I mean, he still gets off. I mean, so he's always a great play. And Detroit has been struggling. And so I think that's going to be an interesting play with Peyton and those guys finally getting on track in the fourth quarter last week and having this matchup against Detroit. I mean, I can see Marius and Peyton finally linking up. It seems like he's been going to Emmanuel a lot, and so it's one of those deals where, they may try to shift a little bit of the focus to Emmanuel because he's been their go-to guy in the red zone, and then Demaris just goes slap off, even though he had a pretty good game last week in the comeback.
Yeah, you don't have to talk about, don't have to convince me on Demarius. I'm all over Demarius, huge Broncos homer, and Demarius is probably my favorite player in the NFL. They really look to him on that critical last drive. I think he got like 3 or 4 passes in a row, and he's just a freak. I think they've been looking to Emmanuel more because defenses have been paying so much attention to Demarius. So hopefully a little more attention gets shifted towards Emmanuel, which will open it up for Demarius. I love him this week. I think the Broncos are going to struggle to run. Detroit has a very good run defense, and because of that, the Broncos are going to have to kind of go back to that shotgun, Peyton Manning offense, and it's indoors, which benefits Peyton as well. So I love the Broncos passing game, and I think Demarius is the clear-cut option. Enough can't be said about Antonio Brown. I mean, you pretty much just play him every week, it feels like. I mean, guy is just so ridiculous in a PPR site. He just has such a high floor. The one concern I have with Julio, because I agree with Tank, he's going to be a target monster all year, and they're just throwing so many quick passes to him. We saw what happened with the Eagles versus Dallas. Dallas kills the clock, so that's very concerning for me, taking opposing teams against Dallas just because a lot of their philosophy relies on killing the clock, and I think they're going to try to do that even more with, Weeden at quarterback. I think they're really going to try to run the ball and just really milk the clock as much as they can. So I love all the top guys. I think Odell Beckham's a great play, but the problem is he's on Thursday, and everyone's going to play him on Thursday. So, I don't love playing guys in the Thursday night game in tournaments, so it's a tough one for me. But all these guys are definitely in play. One guy I don't like that much that's at the top is Calvin. Keep Talib is an absolute stud, and I think the Broncos have a very, very tough secondary, so I'm not as high on Calvin.
Yeah, you basically just stole every note I had. I think Antonio, pay up for him in cash games, even if he's overpriced. Slightly, I don't think he is, but even if he is, just pay for him in cash games because he's so safe. He just gives you such a high floor. It's worth it. Even against the Rams, you get a Tank mentioned. He's going to get a bunch of quick screens. He gets a bunch of short targets. He still has upside going deep. He can score. And so I think that he is just always a smart play in cash games, especially on a PPR site. Beckham, I agree completely. I like the Giants a lot on Thursday night, which is why I probably won't actually play that much. So when I play tournaments on Thursday in Thursday night leagues, I would prefer to fade the game completely. And if I don't feel like that makes sense, then I just won't play that much. And I don't think it makes that much sense with the Giants tomorrow because I like Eli against the Redskins, whoever. Pretty good run defense, but pretty awful against the pass. I think that the Giants are going to throw a lot and could do pretty well. I like Larry Donnell, actually, and Odell, of course. So I'll probably actually end up fading that quite a bit. And then I agree on Demarius quite a bit. And what's interesting is that I think what happens is a lot of people look at the salaries and the actual number and do calculations and stuff like us to determine the value. But the average player probably comes on and sort of picks players based on their rank. And so one thing I like to do is just look at how players are ranked in terms of salary and then figure out how that might affect their ownerships, because sometimes a player like Antonio Brown is 8,900 and he's third in salary, which might actually move his ownership up quite a bit versus if he were 9,100 and we're first in salary. It's only a $200 difference, but psychologically it looks different to the user. And Demarius is fourth in salary on DraftKings this week, but he's, like you said, there's a huge drop. So that $900 savings from number 3, Antonio Brown, is pretty hefty, where he's probably offering quite a bit of value, but it doesn't look like that. And psychologically, I think that'll move people away from him perhaps a little bit more. Maybe even if it's a few percentage points, it's something in tournaments where his ownership will be down a little bit just because of that rank. And so I like to compare that rank to the actual pricing to see if you can find sort of quirks in how players are priced that would affect ownership. And I think that's a positive for Demarius in tournaments.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'm all over Demarius this week in tournaments. I wrote a news blurb earlier about Demarius specifically, and just how he led the NFL in targets last year, and he was just a red zone monster. And so far this year, he has 0 red zone targets. And with just how much of a monster he is, and the fact that he can go up and get it, and just Peyton throwing it to him and targeting him, especially at the end of the game that Peter mentioned, I expect that is going to regress back up pretty significantly. And so when I look at things that could regress, I look at, not only could they regress back to the mean, but also am I getting a discount as a result? And I think this is a situation where Demarius probably is at the skill level of these other top guys, but his salary has decreased as a result of just kind of not getting to the end zone or not getting the targets in the red zone. So not only are you getting a probable regression, but you're also getting him at a discount. So yeah, so he's one of my favorite plays in tournaments this week. So if we move down to the next tier of guys, it's a lot of kind of questionable guys actually. We got DeAndre Hopkins, who was just diagnosed with a concussion, so we don't know if he's going to go. AJ is kind of an interesting play because of how run heavy they are, and even though he got that early touchdown last week, he didn't do much after that. Brandon Cooks has been disappointing. Julian Edelman is right there at 7,000. He is actually leading the NFL in targets so far this year. Jordan Matthews is interesting, but he that Philly offense. Keenan Allen had like 1 million targets, but then not so many last week. It's a really interesting kind of middle tier. Tank, what are your thoughts on some of those guys I mentioned?
Just going into it, I think Cobb looks healthier as the weeks progress, and so I think it's only a matter of time before he gets off. It could be here on Monday night, since everyone's going to be paying more attention to the one who's been catching all the touchdowns, I feel, is James Jones. I like A.J. Green for the simple fact that Baltimore's been struggling. When they lost Terrell Suggs, they lost an important part of that pass rush, and I think that's one of the reasons the Raiders were able to beat them last week. And so, I think A.J. Green has a chance to get off, especially when you see what Amari Cooper and Crabtree were able to do. When you look at Julian Edelman, I can see the Patriots employing a similar approach as the first couple weeks, for the simple fact that if you look at it, Jacksonville, even though it's still early in the season and we don't have a huge sample size, Jacksonville is like 5th against the run. And they have a formidable defensive line, and so it's one of those deals where I would expect them to try to establish the run a little bit more than they did against Buffalo, but then at the same time, using a lot of short passes to get the ball out of Brady's hands quick and let that supplement their running game. So I think Jules and Rob Gronkowski will have similar productivity that they've had in the first couple of weeks. And then Jordan Matthews has had a case of the drops, and the Philly offense has been struggling. I'm kind of off of him, that favorable. Keenan Allen, he dropped the punt return early in the game and never really got going after having a monster game in week 1. So I can see the Chargers trying to get him going again. They know they're going to have to depend on him to make plays outside, so he could be in for another big game just with Phillip Rivers paying more attention to getting him the ball this week.
Yeah, I love that analysis, and I think that mid-tier is really interesting. I agree with the Cobb. I think he's a great Monday night hammer. I think that Jordan Matthews really isn't a great play just because of the secondary they're going against, but again, this could be a perfect contrarian spot for Philly. I'm still just very worried going into face the Jets, and that secondary's looked really elite so far. I think the most interesting guy for me, and I'm curious Bales' opinion, Larry Fitzgerald's still pretty underpriced there, and I think against San Francisco, Arizona might still be winging the ball around. So Bales, what do you think about him?
Yeah, I'm still going to be on Fitz because I think that for tournaments anyway, that matchup still is sort of scary to people where they don't want to play people against the Niners. It's just one of those defenses that we think of as traditionally good, even though they're probably not really that good anymore. But similar thing with like the Ravens, where you just want to people typically tend to avoid players against those defenses, and his salary didn't really move up. I'm not really sure why. He's 5,800. I forget what he was last week, but he wasn't much more if he was. So yeah, I have Fitzgerald as a pretty top value for cash games. I really do like Julian Edelman. The Patriots are projected above 30 points by Vegas. They're number one. Seahawks are number two at like 29.5 or something. There's even if they get up, like we said, I think they can keep throwing the ball. I think he's going to see a ton of targets. Very, very safe on DraftKings because the point per reception doesn't need to score. So if he scores, it's almost a bonus. So I really like Julian Edelman quite a bit in cash. And then Brandon Marshall is pretty interesting to me. If Decker's out, we don't really know right now, but my guess is that Decker wouldn't play. I think it would be pretty rare for him to, even if it's a minor PCL injury, to come back in 1 week and play. And so if he's getting a bunch of targets, I don't have confidence at all that the Eagles are going to be able to stop anyone. It doesn't seem like they dedicate sort of resources on defense to take a player out of the game. We saw that with Julio. They just sort of let him go off. And then because they run up tempo, they'll sort of that'll result in the Jets running more plays than they normally would. So Marshall could see a whole bunch of targets in that game.
I love Brandon Marshall. That's my favorite mid-tier receiver on the week by far, and I should have mentioned him. But that's against that Eagles team who plays up in pace. I mean, he should have a monster game here.
Yep.
And now there's one thing I'll say about Fitz too. Like, I didn't play him in nearly enough lineups last week, but I loved him. And it was for the simple fact that when you watch the Packers play against the Bears in Week 1, I think they like James Jones, even though he's not as big as Fitz. He's like a larger wide receiver, and they were exploiting that matchup against the corners. And so that's why I really like Fitz against Chicago last week. Now, in turn, when you look at the Niners defense, they struggle with deep speed. I think we saw it against the Vikings. Mike Wallace got behind them. And then last week, Antonio Brown, Darius Hayward, Bales. So if I was going to play a receiver from the Cardinals this week, it will likely be John Brown, and expecting him to get off and get behind those cornerbacks versus Fitz. So even though I really like Fitz and I like the passing matchup against the Niners, my play would probably be John Brown over Fitz.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting because I don't think we think about that stuff as much. So like how the size of the cornerbacks matches up with receivers. So you're saying that just the skill set of the Niners cornerbacks is better to deal with Fitz than it is a small, quick guy that can get upfield like John Brown.
Right.
Yeah, that's gold right there, and that's just you're getting such good info from Tank. So Tank, that's a nugget right there that hopefully everyone can utilize, and I definitely think that there's merit with that, especially comparing what Mike Wallace did. I think that's a great comparison with Brown, who can definitely take the top off of defense.
Yeah, I love it. So we actually incorporated a hashtag AskTank hashtag on Twitter for users to ask Tank whatever questions they may have for the upcoming week, and we'll continue to do this throughout the week. So if you have any questions for obviously next week, think about them and send it over to us. And there was one particularly about Brandon Marshall, so I want to ask you, Tank. User at Chuck Hemp says, do you think the Jets' depleted wide receivers in a good matchup lowers the value of Marshall due to the fact that the team the team's double teaming him?
Who are they playing? The Eagles?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Marshall's going to get off. I mean, if you look at Philadelphia in Week 1, They played Julio. Everybody named Mama knew that they were throwing the ball to Julio, and he still got off. And then you look at the Eagles last week, and everyone knew that Terrence Williams was going to have to be the guy to replace Dez, and then he gets off. So, I mean, regardless of what kind of attention they pay to Brandon Marshall, I think he's going to get a fair amount of targets. And, they're going to set up, enough play action with Chris Ivory running the ball that he's going to get, he's just going to get off this week. And, yeah, he may see, some extra coverage, and I think maybe the young receiver that's kind of like a slash receiver, tight end, Anunwa, may be like a really good buy down at like 3,000, especially at but Marshall's the man.
Yeah, I think there was a question of whether he's going to play as well because he got injured in that game as well, so he's questionable. So watch out for that. I want to ask about another guy in this mid tier before we move on to kind of the lower tier and maybe some bargain wide receivers. And that's Jarvis Landry. He's at home against Buffalo, and I think he's a little interesting just because he's kind of in the mold. He's this is a slot guy. He has a low. He catches the ball early on, and I know, Bales, you've done some research on the kind of depth of target and what that means for fantasy value. And so we look at the matchup against Buffalo, and we think, oh, that's really bad because Buffalo, Rex Ryan, great defense. But then you look at, kind of how the Patriots went against them last week, and Julian Edelman had 19 targets. I mean, that's just ridiculous. 19 targets in a single game. And then you kind of look at maybe someone comparable. Maybe they look at film and say, okay, maybe Jarvis is our Julian. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good comparison, a really good point. And those types of receivers. Again, when you were assessing like the matchup or the quality of a defensive unit, it really is dependent on the player. So we talked about Antonio Brown is a little bit more. His production's independent of the matchup because of the types of targets he sees. Jarvis Landry is the same sort of way as Edelman. His average target depth last year was 5.5 yards. He just doesn't go downfield. So it's very likely that I won't use Jarvis Landry in a single tournament lineup. I don't think he has much upside in this matchup. He doesn't get downfield. I don't know how well they'll be able to move the ball overall, but we could see a ton of targets where it just makes a lot of sense in cash games. And even though I do think he's going to be low owned because of the matchup, just because of the upside, I probably won't have too much tournament exposure to him. But I do really like that thought and the idea of assessing every player individually when it comes to how difficult the matchup really is.
Yeah.
Sammy Watkins, anybody? 8 targets last week after a bad first week.
Great GPP play.
Jarvis Landry, before we get off of him, is that
Sure.
the NFL is a copycat league. Whenever a team has success on defense against a tough offense, you're going to see a lot of teams employing similar strategies, whether it's that Amobi kind of defense where you have all the defensive linemen kind of standing up and wandering around because that throws quarterbacks off. Same thing on the offensive side of the ball, too. Buffalo's a really tough defense. New England was able to have some success throwing the ball around a lot. The Dolphins have a similar approach trying to throw the ball around a lot, so you would expect them to use Jarvis Landry in the same way and try to, have similar productivity with him as Julian Edelman had last week.
Yeah, we talked about that last week, and that's pretty interesting, like how you guys look typically at recent games, right? You might look at your most recent game against a team, but otherwise you're looking at their most recent games against other opponents. And sort of maybe there's a little bit of a recency bias with coaches where they think because, this defense has been bad at this over the past 2 or 3 weeks that this is what we should attack now. And it becomes like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where maybe they are bad, maybe they aren't, but if they're going to continue to throw that guy because of what they think, then that's really valuable information for us.
Yeah, the NFL is going to make you stop something. So if you show on tape that you can't cover the deep ball or that you can't stop the counter tray, they're going to keep running it until you make them stop running it. And so I would expect that to happen this week against the Bills.
One other question for you really quickly is, Like, how do you know when a team won't be able to stop something versus when they're going to overcompensate to do it? So, there might be a number one receiver that we know is in a really good matchup, but we know the defense is going to be focusing on him too. So Marshall is an example where I think that the Eagles aren't going to be able to stop him. But what if the Eagles just dedicate everyone, like their entire game plan is focused around stopping Marshall? What are some keys maybe where okay, this is theoretically the best play, but I know that the defense is going to be all over this guy where maybe the weakness of the offense becomes a strength just because of the defensive game plan.
I think it depends on personnel. It also depends on the head coach as well. I mean, like when you're dealing with defensive-minded coaches that are like masterminds like a Bill Belichick, like I know he's going to be able to scheme up a way to take away someone's best player. But when you see a defense like the Philadelphia Eagles that have struggled against every opponent to date, and you really don't have like that guy like a Darrelle Revis where he can just eliminate one person on one side of the field. If you don't have that guy, they signed Byron Maxwell to be that guy, and he is not. I mean, so when you have that on the other side of the ball, then regardless of what they're doing, whether it's trying to bracket him or just cover man-to-man with Maxwell, I just don't think they'll be able to get the job done. And therefore, he may not have the explosive game that you may expect where he just goes off for like 7 for 150 and a couple tubs, but he'll still have a pretty good game just because they won't have the personnel or the strategy to just stop him completely.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. I didn't think about sort of maybe just the philosophy of the head coach and yeah, that's a pretty good point because we know that Belichick. That's one reason I'm very scared about Allen Robinson, even though I think he's cheap this week. We know that it just seems like that's the guy you take out. If you take him out of Jacksonville's offense, they're going to be bad. And Belichick is probably going to do that this week, right?
Yeah.
So that scares me quite a bit.
He gets a visit to Revis Island. Not great for daily fantasy.
All right, yeah. So that kind of leads us. The Robinson thing is a good segue into the lower tier of guys, and we're talking guys 5K or under. And actually, a really interesting group of players I think this week, with some interesting matchups. So we'll start just a little over 5K. We got Vincent Jackson, whose salary is way down. He's 5,400 going against Houston. So. I don't hate that. I'm interested in y'all's thoughts on that as well. Allen Robinson's right under him at 52, so that's kind of a question mark. Garcon is interesting at 5,200, and we have Brown right at 5,100. Devontae is still low. We have Decker, if he plays, is still low. Moncrief got a lot of targets. James Jones is still low, even though he's getting red zone touches. Terrence Williams is still... one of the top guys in Dallas offense, even though Whedon probably lowers him. And then a guy I think I really like a lot this week is Stevie Johnson. He's at 4,300, and it looks like that Ladarius Green probably won't play. So I think that could be a good spot for Stevie against Minnesota. Peter, out of those guys and kind of the lower tier of guys, do you have any favorite plays?
Yeah, well, I know who the most popular play is going to be, and it's going to be Travis Benjamin. And I probably won't have too much of him. Talk about a guy who's caught 3 balls both games and has just put up huge numbers with the punt return and just these long TDs, especially if Johnny Manziel's not starting, who he definitely had a connection with. I'm not going to be on him, but at 4,200, I think a lot of people are going to look to him with the recency bias. So I might have a couple shares in a tournament, but definitely no cash game exposure at all. Terrence Williams definitely stands out to me as a guy kind of in that lower tier range. I think who's going to be a pretty nice play going in against Atlanta. Whedon made that nice throw to him already, and I just think he's going to be the guy there in Dallas taking over the role for Dez. I don't expect anywhere near the similar stats that Dez put up, but I still think he's a pretty viable option. And I'm with you. Probably my favorite guy, and certainly someone I've been looking at a lot in cash games, is Stevie Johnson. Played him in week 1, and definitely considering him again here against Minnesota. I think he has a pretty big game, and San Diego should be throwing some here. So I think he's a viable option. And one other guy I would just throw out there that I think is a decent GPV play. we'll see. I think he's a great play with St. Louis defense. That's Tavon Austin. Only GPP play, but you get the double dip, which I think is so big in tournaments where if he gets a punt return touchdown, you get double the points with the Rams D, and you get the points for Tavon. And I think he's a elite tournament play this week, so I think he could have a couple big catches here potentially.
Yeah, Bales, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Terrence Williams is the guy that interests me the most, just from pure value standpoint. I think that Whedon is going to be pretty good with him. He's had a good connection with him in the past. And then the Falcons are going to run a bunch of plays, I think. Cowboys are probably going to be down in the game. It's very likely. So game script is in his favor. I think he's going to get a bunch of targets. I just think he's good value, and the dip from Romo might not really hurt perhaps as much as people think. I think that Whedon's not that bad for his fantasy value. You mentioned Vincent Jackson, and he's always interesting to me in tournaments. Almost would never use him in cash games, even if he's a good value. And I do think he's a good value. Probably won't use him in cash games because his. So I mentioned Landry's average depth of target 5 yards. Last year, Vincent's was, I believe, over 15 yards. So he catches a very low rate of his passes, but he has huge upside, and he can score at an elite rate. He's like 245 pounds or whatever, converts at a ridiculous rate in the red zone. Their offense, I don't know how good it's going to be, but I do think that Winston improved quite a bit last week, and I think he's going to continue to improve throughout the year. And then Mike Evans, they say he's healthy. I'm not really sure, so I'm not projecting him as if he will be right now. I think that there's probably at least uncertainty that we should bump him down and bump Vincent up in the event that he's not healthy. So I like Vincent a lot in GPPs.
Yeah, and I think the guys for me, I mean, I really like Vincent Jackson. Jonathan Joseph gives up a lot of deep balls for the Texans. And with that matchup with V. Jackson on the outside and him being the deep threat and receiving more targets than Mike Evans, I really like him. I think I already talked about John Brown against San Francisco. I like that matchup. And then also there was one other guy. Man, Crabtree is getting a lot of targets. And I expect Amari Cooper to be covered by Joe Hayden. And that could be a sneaky play right there where Crabtree, gets a lot of targets. And, I mean, that's an opportunity for upside against the second cornerback for the Browns. So that wouldn't be a bad play either. And then Doug Baldwin against Chicago. I mean, he's received like 25% of Russell Wilson's targets to date. I mean, I think they're going to get Jimmy more integrated into the offense, but if he's throwing to a wide receiver, Doug has been the guy. So he may be a sneaky play as well.
Love that call, Tank. I think that's a great way to think about it. And again, it's good to see, it's cool to hear Tank's kind of philosophy, especially with the secondary stuff, given your experience. And obviously, Hayden is, he at least used to be, and definitely still, to me, is an elite corner. And if he's on shadowing Cooper, that's going to open up targets for someone else. And I think that guy definitely has to be Crabtree, who's looked really good. I mean, I know that there's been a lot of talk about his hands, how he has the best hands some coaches have ever seen. And I saw him make a couple ridiculous catches, and I certainly think he's a viable play this week.
Yeah, I love that as well, because I think that there's certain defenses that are just generally good against the pass that you want to avoid, and then there's certain defenses that have just a really good cornerback. And the prototype of that for me, and the reason that I played Decker last week, who did pretty well in the first half at least, is the Colts, who have Vontae Davis. They moved him around on Marshall, and it was just a really good situation, I thought, to get on Decker, who's going up against a lot of Darius Butler, lined up in the slot, and some other cornerbacks who are just much worse than Vontae, where that overall pass defense probably looks better than how a number 2 receiver going up against them, how that would be sort of reflected. And I think that that's another really good situation that I didn't think about too much is Hayden in Cleveland, where maybe their pass defense is boosted so much by him, where the number 2 would be a pretty good play in that situation. And Crabtree is certainly, he's very talented, so and Carr's capable of moving the ball, so I do like that play a lot as well.
Yeah, I like that a lot too. Crabtree. Yeah, this is one of the reasons I like doing this Even, I mean, obviously we're doing it for the listeners, but I like doing this on Wednesday nights for myself as well, because I kind of hadn't thought of Crabtree, but you're right. Yeah, he had 16 targets last week and had a line of 9 for 16 for 111 and a touchdown. And yeah, if you think that he is not going to get Hayden, then yeah, that's a really interesting play. So yeah, so that's great. Any other thoughts on wide receivers before we move on to tight ends? Anyone?
Let's bang through these tight ends and D's.
Perfect. So yeah, so surprise. The top tight end is Rob Gronkowski. He is at 7,400, so he is about $2,000 higher than anyone else. He is at home against Jacksonville, so good spot. He's next player is Jimmy Graham. He is at home. He's at 5,800. Next up is Kelsey, going at Green Bay. He's at 5,000. So you're looking at 2,400 less than Gronk. Eifert is at 4,800, going against the Ravens, and then Greg Olsen is the home against the Saints. Tank, anyone stand out to you?
Well, Gronk is Gronk. He's going to get his targets. He's going to get his touchdowns, and everyone in their mind is going to have him in the lineup. So that just is what it is. I mean, I think we go back to what we talked about earlier with Jimmy Graham and, you know, him being upset that he hasn't received a lot of targets. And I think Seattle's going to try to rectify that situation against, you know, a poor Chicago Bears defense this week. So if there was going to be one guy that I'll bet on heavily this week, it would be Jimmy Graham. With the lack of options that they have in Carolina at Cam Newton's disposal, I mean, you saw last week the first target of the game with the Greg Olsen, and I expect that to continue as well. That offense is going to have to flow through Jonathan Stewart running the ball, Cam using his legs, and also Greg Olsen. I mean, he's trying to integrate some of the wide receivers, but Greg Olsen is his most reliable target. And I think when you look at Martellus Bennett, I mean, we talked about this before. Whenever you have young quarterbacks, I mean, I hate the matchup with Jimmy Clausen, but, I mean, I think Martellus Bennett is going to be his blanket. It's going to be his safety net. And so a lot of balls are going to go to him. So you may not play Jimmy, but if you want to be contrarian, maybe throw in Martellus Bennett. Even though Cam's coming back, and more than likely Cam's going to be the one covering, but, you know, it may be worth a shot in a couple lineups.
Yeah, so Jimmy Bennett stack taking down the middle this week. I love it.
I think the Seahawks, though, have been mediocre against tight ends.
They have.
Yeah, and they've been
plus minus. Yeah,
they've been so much better on the outside. So I don't hate that with Clausen potentially going to him a bunch. I think that's not a cash game play, but potentially a tournament play.
Yeah, and I'm going to keep this simple in my analysis very quick. I do like Jimmy Graham, but for me, tournaments, cash games, it's all about Gronk. Yeah, you have to have Gronk in your lineup. Guy averages more touchdowns per play than anyone in the history of the NFL. So that's pretty good. More touchdowns per play than anyone in the history of the NFL. If you look at him relative to the elite wide receivers, he's significantly cheaper. And if I asked you this, Bales or Tank or whoever, who would you rather play, Rob Gronkowski or Julio Jones, or Rob Gronkowski or Antonio Brown, or Rob Gronkowski or Demaryius Thomas? There'd at least be some pause there. You know, like those are really close in my opinion. So he's a must play for me, and I'm going to have him all over.
Yeah, I think you're taking such a big risk if you don't play Gronk, and just like looking at, so I have just like the point per dollar in front of me, and tight ends overall are just much cheaper per point that we expect than receivers. So I don't hate a double tight end, putting one in the flex. Their prices have dropped overall this year on DraftKings. And if you compare Gronk to other receivers in his price range, you'd probably almost always prefer Gronk, and he's not as good of a bet to go over 100 yards, although he did last week. Maybe he is, but he's a better bet to score 3 touchdowns in a game than probably anyone in the NFL.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, he averages more touchdowns per play than anyone in the history.
I believe he has.
Can't say that enough. Like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, And the best wide receiver in the NFL in terms of converting red zone looks into touchdowns is Bryan, who I think is the best red zone receiver in the league, and I believe he's around mid 40% in terms of converting red zone targets into touchdowns, which is really, really high. The league average, I think, is low 20s, like 22%. And you have bad receivers like Deshaun Jackson is like near 10%, and Gronk, I believe, is above 50% in his career. It's just a crazy, crazy number. He's incredible.
Yeah, get him in your lineups. You'll be happy you did. That's all I can say about tight end. And Graham's a GPP guy for me, and certainly there's merit to anyone outside of Gronk and GPPs just because Gronk's going to be so heavily owned. But I'm going to have a lot of exposure to him in tournaments, and I'm going to be all in on cash.
Yeah, I actually really like the idea of comparing him to the receivers because, as Bales was saying earlier, when we look at the wide receivers, just kind of it's like a mind trick where you see the top guy, and it's almost like, okay, well, I can get Antonio Brown for 100 less than Julio, and he's just as good. So then you take him over, whatever. And Gronk's kind of the same way, where he's just so much higher that I think it scares a lot of people off. When in reality, he probably should even be higher than that.
That's a great point because imagine that Jimmy Graham and Kelsey and Olsen say they were overpriced and they were 7,300 or 7,100 or whatever. It would just make Gronk. You'd be like, oh man, I want Gronk. He's so much better and he's the same price. But that wouldn't change Gronk's value at all. That's just it's completely the perception of how he's priced.
Yeah, and one last comment too is this might be a good week if you like some of these other tight ends to play two tight ends. I love playing that on DraftKings. Tight ends are consistently underpriced, and if you told me a combo that I wouldn't mind at all would be like Crockett Gilmore, Eric Ebron, who Adam Levitan just tweeted out was a really good play this week. One of those guys and Gronkowski playing one of those guys in the flex. Ebron in the flex is the Sunday night play. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially if you want to load up on some studs throughout the rest of your lineup.
Yeah, I really like that too. I've seen a lot of sharp players play two tight ends in the flex. I think before this year it probably wasn't an optimal play, but I think with the depressed prices, I think it's definitely doable, and I've seen a lot of people do it. And there's a lot of still like really cheap tight ends that I think are viable. One that stands out to me is Jared Cook. He's at 2,800 Rams tight end going against Pittsburgh. So I mean, there's just really not many receiving options. So I don't necessarily hate a Foles Rams kind of contrarian stack with Cook. You guys hate that, or do you have any other guys around that 3,000 range that you guys like?
I mean, I like that one. He gets a ton of targets. I was watching that game today, and that was one of his primary targets throughout. And so if you're going to pair one, I mean, I definitely like Cook, so you nailed it with that one.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Awesome. We are almost done. Let's go through the defense, and we'll wrap it up. So we'll start at the top again and kind of work through. So obviously the top one is the Seahawks. They're at 3,400 against Chicago. And the next is Texans going against Tampa Bay. Panthers are next against New Orleans. Cardinals against the Niners. And then New England against Jacksonville. So a lot of good defenses that are pretty good already and really good matchups. Obviously, Seahawks are going to be crazy high owned. I actually tweeted out earlier from the Fantasy Labs Twitter account that Houston, actually, we had them projected as the top defense. So I think that could actually be a decent pivot play if you assume that everyone is going to be on Seattle and you think that Houston kind of has just as much upside. I think that could be an interesting play. Am I being crazy, Tank, or are you just Seahawks all the way?
I mean, I really like the Seahawks, and I think it's a no-brainer against Chicago with Jimmy Clausen starting at quarterback. I mean, there's a chance that, Jameis Winston and that offense can get off against Houston, similarly to how they played against the Saints. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I mean, beat Jax against Jonathan Joseph, I mean, there are a couple battles that he could win. He's a larger cornerback, a larger wide receiver on a smaller cornerback, and so he could take advantage of those matchups. I mean, I think one play that I really like, now that I'm kind of looking through this, one, if Drew Brees doesn't play, then the Panthers against New Orleans. I think that's kind of a no-brainer. But then, two, look at Arizona against San Francisco, where San Francisco's offense is predicated on running the ball. Carlos Hyde is banged up, and Arizona is really good against the run. And then at the same time, they have cover corners where they can play that man defense and just try to plug up every opportunity San Francisco has to really, move the ball down the field. So I can see them being a sneaky good play this week, along with the Panthers if Drew Brees doesn't play.
Yeah, Peter, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Tank just said. This is right up his alley, and certainly want to know who he's on. For me, I think the most interesting defenses outside of Seattle, and I do agree that Carolina will be a great defense to play if Brees is out. But to me, the most interesting ones, I think New England's obviously going to be on a lot of people's radar, just going up against Jacksonville, although Bortles did look a lot better. But I still think they're a really viable defense. And then the one I kind of like is the Browns. I think the Browns could have a really nice game here at home, which I always value. Could pair him with Benjamin. That's probably the only Benjamin exposure I'm going to have again is Browns defense with him in case he gets another punt return touchdown because he's an elite kick return guy. And I think that definitely could be in play here with the Browns defense. And then in addition to that, I talked about Tavon Austin and the Rams D. I don't love the Rams D because I think Pittsburgh's a lead offense, one of the best in the league, but they are back at home. I think they have the potential to get a lot of sacks, especially if Ben tries to extend some plays. And with Ben throwing a lot, I think there could be some picks here, and I love the special teams that St. Louis has. So that's kind of where I'm looking at now. One other sneaky one, and it pains me to say, is Detroit at home. Broncos' offensive line is so bad, and Peyton Manning's going to just fall to the ground if he sees anyone coming close to him. So they could get a lot of sacks, and if the Broncos get down, Payne could be throwing a lot, and his arm hasn't looked as good as it has in the past, so he could throw some picks too.
Yeah, I think people naturally want to save money on defenses, especially in cash games, but this is a week that I think I'm pretty much just going to be paying up. So I probably will have Seahawks in the majority of cash games and the Patriots as well. Mostly Seahawks and then a little bit of the Patriots. And those will probably be the only two defenses that I use, at least in cash games. And I just think they're in such good spots. I believe the Patriots are maybe 13.5-point favorites and the Seahawks are 15-point favorites, something like that. So they're almost certainly going to be leading. So the things that I look for in a defense are that they're going to get a lot of opportunities to rush the passer, which is obviously related to leading late in the game, and then facing a passer who can turn the ball over when he's pressured. And I think those are two check marks that you hit with both of those defenses. So you have a really good opportunity for sacks, and that's the biggest predictor of takeaways it's actually not pass takeaways. So if you want to predict future interceptions, you wouldn't look at past interceptions. You would look at past pressure, and past pressure is the best predictor of takeaways. And so I think that those are just as safe as you can get, I guess, with a defense. And then for tournaments, I'll still have some exposure to those. If you want to go cheap, I think that an interesting one is the Vikings at home against the Chargers. So Phillip Rivers is someone who can he's not super conservative. He can he'll take some chances and can throw can turn the ball over. So if they're down late in the game, he's not just going to sort of be conservative and think up the field. He's going to throw the ball downfield and perhaps get picked off. And I think that the Vikings have a pretty good front four there where they could get to him without blitzing, and if they can do that, then they'll be in a really good spot. But even looking at that, the difference between the Vikings and the Seahawks is only $600, and the Vikings are in the bottom half in salary. They're only $300 from min-priced among defenses, and the Seahawks are number one. So without the deviation in pricing that we've seen in the past with defenses, I just think that it does make sense to actually pay up for defenses this week.
Yeah, that is interesting about the prices, just because the difference between paying up for all positions, you have to look at the difference between like the top guy and the lowest guy. And for like obviously like a top wide receiver and a min salary guy, you're looking at a difference of $6,000 in salary. Whereas on defense, the difference between paying out for an obvious value, the top defense in the Seahawks 34, and the lowest one, which is the Bucks at 25, which actually may not even be that bad of a play. It is only just about $1,000. So that is interesting. Do you guys think, Bales, I'll ask you to start. Do you think that the Seahawks defense ownership in tournaments is directly tied with Stark's ownership?
In what way?
Like if Starks plays, then that allows everyone to pay up for Seahawks defense.
Oh. Yeah, I don't know. I would have to look at that because it's not like the Seahawks are that much more expensive than. I mean, they're only probably $400 or $500 more than just a mid-tier defense. I don't know, but I do think that does affect roster construction a lot. So I think that that's a good point. I don't know how well we can predict where people are going to pay up, but if everyone's rostering Starks, yeah, they have a lot more salary left, and they're way more likely to go bigger at other positions. So I would say it would affect it a little bit, but I think the Seahawks are going to be the highest owned defense, probably by far, actually, in tournaments.
Sounds good. Cool. Any other thoughts on defense, or I guess we can wrap up the Week 3 analysis and wish everyone the best.
Yeah, no more thoughts from me on defense outside of get Seattle in your cash games. A lot of different merits for different defenses and GPPs, but thanks again for all you guys coming on, and Tank in particular, thanks. Got to give Tank a follow at TankWilliams13. I did retweet something that he will be taking some more questions under hashtag AskTank, so definitely hit him up. Tank has more insight into how defenses play and just all this stuff for fantasy, and he's a great follow, so definitely give Tank a follow.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And then just following up on one last defense, Bryan kind of alluded to it. The Buccaneers are really good. I mean, that may be a sneaky play at 2,500 against Houston, just for the simple fact that we don't know if Arian Foster is going to be back. They have Ryan Mallett, and I watched that game against the Panthers, and he wasn't that accurate. I think he throws the ball a little bit too hard on the shorter passes, and guys were having a lot of drops. So, and he'll be one that's prone to throwing an interception for a pick six too. So, if you want to save at defense and then stack up in other areas, I mean, he may be a good play. And other than that, man, just another great podcast. You know, congrats to Bales. Mm-hmm. Hopefully he gets lucky again this week after being on the podcast, and hopefully he gives us a little leprechaun luck so the rest of us can get an attorney too.
Let's lock that down, guys. Let's all get in the tournament as well as Bales. That'd be a pretty sweet week.
And we'll have the podcast that week from Vegas, right?
Yeah,
that would be awesome. Yeah, we'll do that live from a sushi dinner.
Yeah, once we all win tickets.
Well, we'll have a pretty expensive meal with sushi if we're all out there. We'll load up a pretty good tab, I'm sure.
And Tank will lose a credit card roulette this time.
He's never lost. That one.
Yeah, I've never lost either, actually.
Or no, you've never lost, Tank.
Have
you lost, Tank?
No, I've never lost. No.
Oh man.
I've played probably 20 times and I've never lost.
So I'd be a lock to lose because I definitely have lost multiple times. So with you two, it'd be tough to not lose there. But yeah, good luck in Week 3 for you guys. I'm excited for it, and definitely make sure to hit up Tank on Twitter.
Yeah, please do. Very underfollowed, criminally underfollowed. You should follow him and ask him questions. Obviously, hashtag AskTank, and we'll get to a bunch more questions next week and do all that. So thanks for listening. Good luck in Week 3. Hope you guys take down a ticket. If you want to sign up for Fantasy Labs, you can use code Mears. It's my last name. It's right here, MEARS at checkout. Get the best deal. I'll also put a link in both the podcast and the YouTube channel. So thanks for either listening or watching us. I'm not sure why you would do either, but thank you for doing it. And good luck to you. We'll talk to you guys next week for week 4.